I'm going to be talking about the second part of the tutorial. So while the first part of the tutorial was kind of broadly trying to summarize the literature on social media and kind of again looking at all the different parts of the life cycle, the sort of purpose of the second part of the talk is we also wrote this handbook chapter which kind of talks about a practical guide for studying some of the questions that we talked about in the first part, in particular focusing on kind of somewhat unique methods that people are using to study this question relative to maybe other topics in economics, which is kind of a more experimental approach, right? Um, and so again, to start off, again, social media platforms, as Lena said, they're ubiquitous in the modern economy. Most people are using them. People spend a lot of time on them, which makes it kind of a nice experimental grounds to study both questions around the platforms themselves, but also kind of more broadly around human behavior, right? And so social media platforms, but in particular digital platforms, enable sort of newer types of experiments. And so to fix ideas, when we're going to be discussing experiments today, again, there are some papers, for instance, that look at, Facebook making a change to their algorithm internally and the effects on that. When we're going to be thinking about experiments, we're going to be thinking of kind of experiments that researchers like me, Lena, or alone can kind of run without platform cooperation, right? So that again, we don't need to get Facebook's approval to kind of run some type of intervention, right? And so these experiments, again, can be used to study two types of questions. The first is we may just be interested in kind of the inner workings of the platform itself. What is the effect of some changes to, again, the type of content that people see, how they spend their time? Again, we can kind of look at first order questions about the platforms themselves. The second thing that we can study is, again, because people spend so much of their times on these platforms and, again, they interact with other human beings, it's typically a high ecologically valid setting to actually study sort of intrinsic things about human behavior and kind of how people interact with each other, right? And so there's kind of been two streams of types of experiments that, again, some have sort of focused on studying the platforms, others had kind of focused on sort of studying human behavior. One thing I want to argue is that I think, especially for kind of policy related questions, right? So, in a lot of the discussions that Lena had, again, there's a lot of policy debate in this topic, right? About misinformation, antitrust, mental health. And so, again, this kind of important for us as researchers to kind of study these topics. And so, again, it's not necessarily something we kind of want to purely defer to the platforms themselves to study. And so, in particular, for a lot of these policy making type or policy type of questions, these types of experiments are really important because us as researchers are more objective and kind of have less skin in the game than the platforms themselves. And so these types of experiments have been particularly useful for kind of guiding the policy debate. Okay. So again, to give you sort of some example studies that we'll talk about, again, relative to kind of the first part of this talk, we're going to focus here on a few sort of example experiments. Again, we're going to be a little bit biased towards our own work, so we can talk about the experimental details in a little bit more than we can for others. But again, some example studies to kind of give you a flavor for what are the types of interventions that people run. So Roy Levy, one of the organizers here, again, ran a pretty well-known study a few years ago that effectively kind of nudged people to sort of follow, again, either Fox News or New York Times or kind of different news pages on Facebook and saw kind of how that would change the type of news they consumed, polarization, and a bunch of other measures. Hunt Alcott and co-authors, again, they're in their 2020 paper, again, have people manually deactivate Facebook and tries to understand kind of, again, what are the welfare implications of this in terms of how it impacts their mental health, how it impacts, again, their political knowledge. The 2022 part, which again, the paper that Lena discussed on digital addiction, tried to understand, again, using having people install mobile phone software to kind of experimentally restrict how much time they spend, to kind of understand, again, what are the forces of addiction that are potentially present in usage. Again, this Guryov et al. Paper sets up kind of a mock social media platform and kind of has people decide whether or not to share different news postings to kind of study misinformation. My paper, again, experimentally restricts the apps that people use to kind of understand how they substitute across platforms. Rafa and co-authors, again, build a Chrome extension that allows them to kind of hide toxic content and see how that impacts their engagement on the platform. And this Larson et al. Paper, again, uses social media ads and does a sort of a randomization at a regional level to understand how these social media ads kind of impact vaccinations, right? So you can see from these example studies, again, there's kind of a common mechanism of kind of using social media, but they're studying potentially vastly different questions. Okay. And so what we're going to talk about in this talk is again a practical guide to conducting these studies. The typical components of these type of experiments are, again, sort of three stages, and social media can be used for some or all of them, right? So the first stage that's typical in an experiment is, again, I recruit participants, right? And so there's sort of two things you can do. The first is, again, you can use social media ads to actually recruit people, right? And so again, given that so many people are on these platforms, again, we'll talk about all the sort of pros and cons of using social media ads to recruit participants. But again, you can directly get participants on these platforms. You can also, again, still study social media, but get participants from kind of traditional sources, right? So you can use things like Prolific or Cloud Research Connect or university lab polls, right? So you can still, again, recruit participants directly from social media, again, to study non-social media related questions. You can use labs or online samples to get people to study social media. But again, the first typical component is recruitment. The second component is typically generating an intervention, which again, in many cases, is just manipulating an experience at an individual level, right? And so again, changing, for instance, whether or not I have access to Facebook, whereas I keep Lena's access to Facebook, or having Lena sort of follow a page while I don't follow a page. And then finally, kind of analyze the social media data, right? And so again, this can be kind of studying social media itself in terms of how people post or how they spend their time, or again, it can be some sort of broad behavioral outcome, which again doesn't necessarily have to be about the platform itself. Okay? Now, one relevant analogy to kind of thinking about these types of experiments is again, you will argue that they're very accessible, especially for junior researchers. But a lot of it is kind of sometimes akin to running a small business, right? So kind of again, you can think you have to do your sort of top of funnel thing of kind of having a marketing campaign to recruit users. And so again, we have to think a lot more about selection relative to a small business owner. But again, the sort of first component here is trying to actually convince people to kind of get into this study, which again potentially manipulates something in their social media experience. The second is that a lot of the studies that we're going to talk about are going to require maintaining and running an active intervention. And so again, there's going to be sort of a lot of kind of IT management in terms of making sure that again people are kind of actually the software you're using is working. And then finally, again, it's important to kind of manage participant communication to minimize attrition, right? So especially if you're going to be thinking of doing a longitudinal study, again, you have to have it so that sort of the participants kind of trust the software you're using and trust the experimenter, which again requires kind of good customer experience. Okay. And so in this talk, I'm going to focus on each of these different components separately. We'll start by recruitment, talk about the interventions and data, and then talk about some limitations and challenges. Okay. So when we think about recruitment, again, one of the main benefits of social media samples is that there's just a lot of, in principle, reachable uses, right? And so from meta ads alone, you can, in principle, reach 2 billion different people to kind of potentially be in your study. Again, just some benchmarks. If you think about Prolific, which is one very common panel, you can get like around 120,000 people. YouGov has access to a much larger panel of 26 million people, but this all in principle pales in comparison to kind of the available population through Facebook. The other thing that's nice about this is, again, if you think about recruiting people, for instance, from a Prolific or YouGov, these guys are doing a lot of different surveys and stuff, right? And so typically when you recruit somebody from a social media platform, they're not necessarily kind of professional survey takers, right? They don't take, 20 surveys in a week. And so again, that's sort of typically a good thing if you're a researcher. This is particularly useful in developing countries, right? So if you think about some of these panels, they have a wide reach in the US, but if you're doing something in a developing country, it's much less likely that you can rely on kind of a survey panel company. And so Facebook ads can be particularly useful for that, right? And so again, apart from accessing a broad sampling frame, it allows you to kind of target a niche set of users, right? So one of the sort of distinctive aspects of social media is again that you can actually target very specific groups. So for instance, I can target people that live in Evanston, Illinois, or Urbana-Champaign, Illinois. I can target people that again follow the New York Times or are interested in Taylor Swift. I can follow people that follow, have specific demographics. So if I'm only looking, for instance, to recruit, females for my study, or I'm only looking to recruit people that are, under the age of 30, I can directly kind of target them on the platform. And so again, there's a wide number of kind of direct interest that you can kind of condition on in your targeting. The second thing which is nice is you can in principle kind of do indirect targeting. So you can actually kind of take a set of email addresses and kind of put together a lookalike campaign that can give you kind of users that are behaviorally similar to the set of users that you put in. And so again, a lot of researchers have used this to study kind of very particular populations that would probably be very hard to do kind of outside of the social media context, right? So for instance, this Yager et al. Paper studies the subset of political activists. Hakamov et al. Studies French high school seniors. Gouleroy et al. Studies LGBTQ young adults. And Sanchez et al. Studies voters in local elections, right? So again, in principle, if you're really interested in studying a particular subpopulation, this is a particularly powerful way to do so. Okay. So what does this actually look like? Like, what are the mechanisms that you actually need to do if you're a researcher and trying to run an advertisement, in particular on the Meta ecosystem? And so the typical sequence of events is effectively, you go and you buy, you buy an ad on Facebook, Instagram, the sort of audience network, which gives you reach outside of the Meta platforms. You'll put what's called a sort of tracking pixel on your website. And so again, a lot of researchers in practice will kind of put this at the end of a survey completion, right? And so this basically tells Meta, if someone saw the ad and then ended up converting, that data and identifier is sent back to Meta, and then Meta can kind of use that to measure and optimize distribution, right? So if you wanted to, target people that end up actually completing the survey, this is kind of the mechanisms to do it. Again, this leads to some concerns about selection that's a little bit black boxy, but we'll get back to that in a little bit. But this would kind of be the typical sequence of events. And so there's been some research that's actually looked at how does this impact the end users that actually end up in your sample. So again, if we're thinking of I'm a researcher that's wanting to use this method for recruitment, researchers typically like to be very careful about understanding the degree of selection to their study, because this is really important for thinking about external validity. And so this Neuendorf et al. Paper sort of does, compares differences between kind of advertisements that are optimized for impressions, for clicks and conversion. And so again, while they find, as you would expect, again, targeting typically improves over time, especially for conversions because of delivery optimization, it can lead to a little bit mixed success in terms of actually getting a reasonably representative population. And so again, this is something to kind of keep in mind. Okay. And so in practice, this is kind of how it would work if you cared about recruiting through this. And so what are the challenges, right? So as I laid that flow out to you, especially if you kind of pick conversion optimized advertising, you should be a little bit concerned that again, you don't really know kind of what Meta is selecting on when it kind of decides which consumers to show the ads to. And so again, this leads to selection into that final sample being a little bit murkier to kind of understand. And so again, in terms of selection on demographic observables, we have some evidence from this Boas et al. Paper that shows that again, if you kind of compare a set of consumers that end up in a study coming through Meta ads and compare it to recruiting people on a prolific or something like that, you get similar selection at least on demographics. But again, the sort of unobserved component is a little bit murkier. What some researchers have tried to do to kind of overcome at least some of this representative issues is to use quota sampling, right? Which is basically a methodology that you basically define, I want X number of people in each of these different demographic buckets. And then you kind of go and recruit and just kind of match that so that at the end you kind of get something akin to a representative sample, at least on demographics. But again, even using these techniques, there's always kind of that concern about kind of what is the selection of unobservables you have to be worrying about there, right? And so again, that's one thing to keep in mind when kind of doing these things is that, again, this representativeness aspect is a little bit murkier to think through. Okay. Now, the second thing to wonder about is how costly is this, right? So unlike on a survey platform where you just say, if you complete the survey, you get $5, here you basically have to pay, you kind of, it's a little bit harder to predict ex ante kind of how much you're going to have to pay because you're going to have to run an advertising campaign and then kind of see who gets into it. right? And so we have some benchmark of kind of ranges from the literature. These can be as low as 40 cents, but some studies kind of have it's kind of as high as $4 for survey completion. And if you kind of want people to not just kind of complete a survey, but also install software, this tends to be a little bit more expensive as well. As sort of a few general rules of thumb, kind of across a bunch of studies and literature, again, typically more granular targeting is costlier, right? So if you're just looking for individuals in the US, that's probably going to be less expensive than, again, people that follow the New York Times that live in Ann Arbor, Michigan, or something like that. Okay. The second is that there's been some research that's shown that kind of exactly the ad design you have and the copy that you use, in particular, whether or not you kind of mention incentives in your study and your sort of ad copy leads to a trade-off between sort of costs and representativeness. And so again, it's kind of really important if you're doing this in practice to kind of really think through, again, who's actually ending up in my sample and kind of in your baseline survey, kind of thinking about this very carefully. And one thing to note is, again, a lot of these costs are from studies that were run pre basically 2022. And so again, my work and some others has kind of shown just how much kind of advertising has become much less effective on Meta after a lot of these type of privacy regulations. And so you should view these as kind of being a little bit of a lower bound if you're doing this in 2025. Um, Finally, there's a little bit of a concern about sample quality relative to prolific, right? So I said, you have in principle 2 billion people from Facebook ads relative to kind of 120,000 on prolific. But again, on prolific, these are guys that kind of have to build up a reputation of kind of producing high quality surveys. And so there's no one vouching for these participants. There's higher reported kind of fraudulent and duplicated responses. Again, anecdotally, I've noticed in the past year or so, there's been a lot more of this kind of coming from Facebook. And so again, if you're going to use this as a kind of recruitment tool for your study, it's really important to kind of do due diligence on kind of the sample that actually ends up in that final part. Okay. Okay. So that's all I have to say about kind of the recruitment part, and now maybe the more interesting part about kind of interventions and limitations. But are there any questions people have about kind of recruitment or anything in general we're talking about here? Okay, cool. And so what are the considerations that you need to think about when kind of designing an intervention? And so I think the key idea, which differentiates, the type of experiments that researchers can run on these types of platforms relative to kind of more traditional markets that we would think about, is the real key idea is that, again, each individual kind of gets their own version of kind of a Facebook, TikTok, or Amazon, right? So again, the difference, I can do something to change, Lena's version of Facebook while keeping mine the same, which is again a lot of sort of brick and mortar markets not necessarily the case, right? And so again, just kind of a brief analogy between papers, right? So for instance, Chris Conlon and Julie Mortimer have written a sequence of papers that kind of tries to look at, substitution patterns as a result of product unavailability. And kind of the typical market that they'll use is, they have this vending machine market where again you kind of remove the Twix from a vending machine. And effectively, again, if Lena and I go to that same vending machines, they can't make it so that Lena has the Twix and I don't have the Twix, right? And so again, they try to measure second choice diversion ratios, again, from kind of these brick and mortar product removals, right? The sort of digital analog of this is like you can say, well, I can make it so that, Lena has the Twix and I don't, and I can use that to kind of get a more granular measure of substitution, right? And so this is effectively, what I do in my paper, which is basically, again, to kind of experimentally restrict, YouTube and Instagram for some subset of participants and kind of use that to understand on kind of individual level how people substitute, which gives you a little bit kind of a more granular notion of diversion relative to kind of market level ones. And so in general, in a lot of these types of studies, again, as a researcher, we're typically, again, interested in the effect of X on Y. And what we can do is we can say, well, because we have this individual level distribution, I can make it so that Lena changes something, or we have some external software that changes Lena's version of the app while kind of keeps mine the same. And at the same time, we can kind of measure this Y in a lot more granularity. So sometimes we can get it from the platform directly, but other times, again, we can kind of build external software which kind of extracts exactly what Lena's doing on her device without kind of, again, impacting measurement for other people. Okay. Now, sometimes, again, this X is not something we can necessarily move around. So, for instance, if there's the question of like, to what extent does the news feed lead to polarization, we can't, completely move around the news feed as an external experimenter. But sometimes, again, we can move around some Z that moves around X, right? So, as one example, you can think of kind of in Roy's experiment, where they kind of make people follow the New York Times or follow Fox News. Again, I can kind of make them follow that so that it kind of moves around something on the news feed, which allows me to understand how that news feed impacts, for instance, political knowledge. Okay. And so importantly, this idea enables kind of conducting these platforms experiments without platform cooperation, right? Because I, as kind of the external researcher, can kind of sit on top of the platform using my external software or kind of getting users to change some features, which allows me to randomize without kind of relying on Meta doing that randomization for me. Okay. Any questions about that?
Just one question about measuring individual level data. Does this Can this be done without the platform approval or also the users? Is there any kind of privacy concerns here?
Yeah, so it's a great question, right? And so again, I think I'll get into it on the next couple slides. But effectively, again, you can think, one obvious solution is to use surveys, but a lot of experiments, including again the ones that like Lena and I run, people install kind of individual software that allows for that data collection and that manipulation, right? And so as you would expect, you have to think very carefully about kind of who selects into that sample and kind of how do you think about that, right? But that's kind of the key, right? The key intuition is basically that again, you can install some individualized software that changes your experience, but not Lena's, and so that allows you to run an experiment on Meta, for instance, without Meta kind of having to give the green light for it. Does that make sense?
Yes, great, thanks.
Yeah. Okay. And so before we get into the interventions, I think it's important to kind of talk about some technical preliminaries that kind of, again, lay out what's the scope of things one can actually do. Okay. And so the first sort of direct way to kind of interact with the platform is to use their APIs, right? And so in principle, you can think this just allows you as the researcher to kind of get, user data, in some sense directly from the platform's database. But again, you're limited to kind of whatever things they can kind of give back to you, right? And so again, one thing you can do is again, if you use, for instance, like the X or the Reddit APIs, you can again retrieve public posts on the platform, right? So you can directly get for, some particular hashtag or some particular subreddit, will posts come back. You could also kind of have a private API, right? So again, users can opt in to have the researcher kind of see private posts or take actions on their behalf. But again, one challenge as we'll talk about is that's only available on kind of a few sets of platforms. And so again, you're kind of limited to whatever capabilities the platform has kind of built in to the API. Okay? The second thing that you can in principle do is again to this question of kind of like how can I actually do these manipulations is one of the most common things, especially on kind of the desktop or laptops, is to have a browser extension, right? And so again, if you kind of go on Facebook or any website of your choosing, any user can kind of go and inspect the source on that website, right? So you can see exactly what's the HTML that kind of Facebook has rendered, what is the JavaScript that they've kind of loaded in there. And so in principle, you can think the browser extension basically kind of sits on top of that and then says, okay, well, I can actually just read whatever is on the page, and I can in principle manipulate it, right? So for instance, if I wanted to change the number of likes that showed up on a post, I can just kind of change that HTML element through the browser extension. And so at least on kind of the desktop, the browser extensions are relatively powerful, right? You can extract content, you can extract how much time people spend, you can extract browser settings, like what are their sort of cookies that are sent. And you can also modify this content and modify these browser settings, right? So if you wanted to remove posts, as some experiments do, if you wanted to change some browser settings, you can in principle do that. The second thing you can do, which is again is not on the desktop or laptop, but more kind of on the mobile phone, is again you can use external software to kind of extract some things about what goes on in the phone, right? And so relative to browser extensions, again, phone apps are kind of engineered in a little bit of a different way. So you can think again, each of them kind of runs in their own little black box. And unlike the web where you can kind of, right click and kind of see whatever HTML is on that web page, you can't do the same thing on mobile, right? And so that makes data collection a little bit harder. And so research that has kind of looked at this, again, typically these methods only work on Android phones because they effectively require that a third-party app kind of sits on top of the operating system. And again, for time extraction, it can kind of ping the screen every few milliseconds and kind of say what's on the screen right now, what's on the screen right now, which can give you a measure of time. Until recently, again, you couldn't really get out much content, but there's some limited ways you can do that. But a lot of the manipulations of kind of content that you can do on the desktop, you can't necessarily do on the mobile phone. And so again, this will kind of limit what kind of studies you can run. And then finally, again, another type of technical software people use are Selenium bots, which again allows you to kind of explicitly code a routine of user interactions and kind of imitate real users, but these are used a little bit less than these two types of software. Okay. In terms of some useful open source tools, right? So if you want to run one of these studies, again, you typically would have to kind of build the Chrome extension or the mobile app from scratch. And so there's a few nice open source tools. So for instance, WebMonk by Chiara Fornato, Andrea Fradkin, and Chris Carr basically is kind of an open source browser extension which allows for modification of content, tracks browsing behavior, and prompts users to complete tasks, and kind of it abstracts away from you a lot of the sort of technical details of kind of how would you actually do that extraction and that modification. In terms of mobile phones, so Alina and co-authors open source the app that they used on phone dashboard. So again, this allows you to kind of control and measure time spent and set time limits. Um, I don't know if this is out exactly yet, but there is a sort of ability to kind of collect screen content through this Princeton Smart app, which again allows you to kind of, basically using accessibility and kind of screenshots of content, at least give you kind of a keyword stream of data of what people are actually seeing on their phones, right? And this is kind of, again, at least to our knowledge, kind of the best data extraction you can kind of get from mobile at the time. Okay. Okay. So what do you use all this for, right? And so what are the types of interventions people have run? And so again, the first type of intervention is kind of encouraging changes in time use, right? So you can think the kind of Alcott et al. 2020 paper had people sort of encourage people to manually deactivate their account. And so again, you would go on the account level and just restrict, I'm not, I deactivate my Facebook account, and the research can kind of occasionally kind of ping to see whether or not your account is still deactivated. The kind of more recent approaches to this, which I do in my paper and Lena does in their paper, is again to use third-party software to kind of restrict at the application level, right? So instead of kind of relying people to manually deactivate their accounts, I can kind of have a third-party application that says, when you go and open Facebook, it's no longer available for you, right? And so these types of interventions, again, kind of encourage changes in time use. Again, in Lena's paper, they're mainly using this to kind of quantify the role of digital addiction. In my paper, I'm looking at kind of how consumers substitute across social media platforms, again, using the observed time usage and the variation induced by restricting software. Okay. The second type of interventions that one can do is again is to encourage changes in on-platform behavior, right? So Ray in his paper again kind of nudges participants to follow certain news pages, which again, if you can do this, there's high ecological validity. There's typically high compliance because again, it's kind of a natural thing that people are doing on the platform. And so there again, you can kind of just it's not requiring kind of a lot of this external software. People are more likely to follow the New York Times, for instance, than install some of this external software. Yeah. Um, Finally, we can encourage people to install third-party software, which directly manipulates the experience that they have on the platform themselves. And so again, the first paper that at least we're aware of to do this is Rafa's paper, which kind of has people install a Chrome extension that kind of experimentally removes toxic content as they're browsing on Twitter and kind of tries to understand how this impacts their overall engagement. Again, this Farinato et al. Paper does this outside of the social media context, kind of measuring the degree of Amazon self-preferencing. And so as was mentioned before, again, there's higher compliance costs here, right? So you're going to have people that are going to be willing to kind of enter into this sample, install an application, but it's going to give you kind of a much wider scope of interventions because you can kind of do arbitrary manipulations of kind of whatever is going on that page. Whereas, again, especially this type of one really only works if there's sort of some built-in platform feature that you can have a random set of users manipulate. Any questions about this? Okay, cool. Another option that people could do is again to basically use to basically run an experiment without people actually knowing they're in the experiment. So, for instance, if this Larson et al. Paper uses geographically targeted ads on vaccine campaigns, right? And so this is nice because again, they have a cluster randomized design at the regional level, and basically again, I don't if I'm getting the ad, I don't necessarily know that I'm in some experimental campaign, but again, they can kind of compare across a bunch of different regions to see what's the effect of these ads at the regional level on vaccination. Again, this Srivan paper, exogenally changes the attention that different posts get by adding AI-generated comments to Reddit, right? So again, kind of these are implemented by the researcher, but the kind of people that are experiencing the treatment kind of don't know they're necessarily in a study. And so again, there's limited experimenter demand here. Um, Another option that people do that again Lena does in one of her papers and this Guriel et al. Paper do is basically to have kind of a middle ground between kind of a full sort of traditional survey and again some of these sort of on-platform interventions that we've talked about. And so again, here you can kind of think you're exposing people to kind of posts in a survey, and you can kind of see have much more compliance and control than kind of on the Facebook news feed. And so again, this kind of in the middle point between kind of running it on the platform itself and a pure survey experiment. But again, it allows you much more kind of control over what's going on. And then finally, there's a class of experiments kind of use algorithmic audits, right? So again, researchers have used a number of approaches, including using Selenium bots to kind of randomize feedback. And again, this Brown et al. Paper has a bunch of human subjects go and kind of randomize the initial YouTube video that they look at, right? And so you can kind of see here the scope of different types of interventions uh, uh, range between kind of having again some external software that does some manipulation versus kind of trying to leverage on-platform features to kind of manipulate the experience that people have. And so again, there's kind of a trade-off of kind of feasibility versus and sort of scope of interventions versus potential like loss of representativeness and external validity. Any questions about the interventions? Okay. Keep going. So we can use these same tools to collect data for analysis and assess compliance. And so again, the API is again directly operated from the platform. A few example studies of this is this Birch et al. Paper randomly gives fewer words and extracts Reddit posts. Roy's paper uses the API to kind of monitor whether people comply with following Facebook pages. Now, what are the challenges to kind of using this? Again, as we mentioned, there's instability over time. And so again, there's potential for kind of unobserved actions from the platform. Platforms may remove posts. Furthermore, in the sort of longer run, platform policies are potentially highly variable. Again, historically, X and Reddit have been widely used by the research community, but again, they're becoming less popular because again, there's been a lot of restrictions on those APIs. Okay. Um, Again, in terms of this third-party software, the type of data you can collect from this is, again, Roy collects browsing history, I collect time spent, the Rafa's paper collects posts and the ads observed by individuals. Again, as we discussed on mobile phones, you can mainly get time spent and keyword content. The challenges with this are, again, there's a higher chance of self-selection to these studies. The other thing which is important to note is if you're thinking about studying social media, most social media actually happens on mobile. And so again, there's sort of a question of if you only do this on desktop, you're potentially missing out on kind of the main ways that consumers interact with social media. But kind of as a general rule of thumb, it's like life is substantially harder collecting data on mobile relative to desktop. And again, you're much more limited in the scope of interventions that you can actually do. And so again, it's kind of a question of of feasibility. And again, what is exactly the question you're looking at, and is it really important to kind of have that mobile piece? Yeah. Um, Again, in terms of other types of data people collect, again, one approach is to have just purely manually collected data, which is very valuable but has high labor costs. So, for instance, this Again et al. Paper that Lena mentioned in the first part of the tutorial collects posts by recording via Zoom, right? So they have people manually kind of scroll on the platform and they just log what are the posts that they see. Collis et al. And Lin et al. Kind of incentivize participants to manually export their Facebook data and send it to them. Again, these things are very valuable, but they're potentially higher labor costs and potentially heightening experimenter demand effects relative to kind of some of the interventions we talked about before, where again, especially if you're running kind of like a 2 or 3 week intervention, at some point you feel like the participants forget that they have software installed, whereas here again, it's very sort of noticeable that someone's watching you. And so that's something to look out for. Similarly, sort of more traditional data like surveys is typically easy to collect, right? Researchers run survey experiments all the time. All you need to do is join it to some platform identifier. A lot of the sort of main outcome variables, for instance, in the sort of well-known Alcott et al. Paper, use survey data. And again, there's some challenges in terms of the noisiness of survey measures and increased likelihood of experimenter demand relative to the software. Okay. Finally, another type of data that people use is again linking to external sources to social media data, right? So this Bond et al. Paper is a study that was run internally at Facebook, and they can kind of link Facebook users to public voter files. Similarly, this Larson et al. Paper I've discussed a few times, again, tries to link the randomized ads that they show to county level vaccination data. Okay. And so again, as with the interventions, there's always a trade-off between kind of thinking about data quality, representativeness, and kind of the pure feasibility of an intervention here. Okay. Any questions about data and interventions?
Just one question, Guy. You mentioned that if you're running a multiple week experiment and if it's like a software that you installed,
Yeah,
probably people are less aware of it compared to if you ask them to install something and they
yeah.
feel like they are being watched. Just wondering how much of that effect you do see in the data that like in the first case there's some transitory effect at the beginning, maybe in the first week, but then it kind of changes over time.
Yeah, so I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think a lot of these studies typically have like a burn-in period of like a week, or at least my studies,
Hmm.
where again, people install the software and then there's sort of natural browsing. I think it kind of depends on to the extent on the intervention, at least from my personal experience. Like on the desktop, it seems like people seem to forget that it exists to the point where you have to like email them a bunch, like, please remove the
Hmm.
extension. On
I
mobile,
see.
it's usually a bit more salient because again, just on mobile, there are a lot more permissions that they typically need to actually get these things to run. And so again,
Hmm.
there it's a little bit more salient for the participants. But again, when we're thinking about experimenter demand for these software studies, I mean, if you're tracking someone for 4 weeks, you're kind of making the assumption that they're willing to kind of change their behavior to satisfy some hypothesis that they think you're studying. Um,
Yeah.
Whereas for survey data, again, it's much easier for someone to be like, oh yeah, I think this is the case, right? And so again, it's much more naturalistic relative to traditional survey data.
Got it. Thanks.
Okay, cool. So let me talk about limitations and challenges. I'll go through this quickly so that I have some time left for the conclusion and the sort of open questions across the life cycle. So what's one key limitation to be aware of? So again, platform experiments are typically very good if you're looking at kind of low effect size interventions, because again, Meta can recruit potentially millions of people into a study. If you're an external researcher, again, you're probably going to be limited to kind of much smaller sample size than someone like Meta can get. And so again, uh, it's very important to kind of think through what is the effect size you think your intervention is going to actually have on participants. And so again, if you think that this is a low effect size type of intervention, you're probably going to be underpowered if you're going to use one of these types of experiments. But again, if you think that there's relatively higher effect sizes as a general rule of thumb, that's where these type of experiments tend to shine, right? Um, Again, there's some ways to get over these power limitations. So something that researchers have done is, again, especially if you're doing these software type of experiments, you can typically, again, you're typically running some kind of longitudinal study. You can collect very rich baseline data, which allows you to kind of parcel out a lot of individual level heterogeneity, which can help a lot for power in these instances. Again, you can have within participant designs given the length of some of these studies. And so these are kind of some tacks that people have taken, but in general, again, it's kind of very important to kind of be mindful of like what you actually expect to happen from your interventions. Yeah. Another common concern is attrition. So again, at least in terms of comparison of some of the field experiments we're talking here today to sort of field experiments more broadly in economics, right? So this Ghana et al. Paper does a analysis of kind of attrition across 88 field experiments. And again, it's typically around 15%, which is similar to the attrition from some of the studies we've talked about here today. Again, some things that experimenters have done to avoid this is trying to postpone treatment to kind of relatively late stage, right? So again, making it so that, especially if you're installing software on for people, again, you've kind of had people select out on kind of the earlier stages of the study. So that, and again, being very careful about measuring to what extent that selection happens, but kind of backloading it so that at least post-treatment, you don't have too much selection out of the study. Okay. Other challenges, again, on social networks, there's always the concern of spillovers between participants. Very reasonable to expect given the social nature of platforms. And again, it's kind of important to consider whether quantifying spillovers is relevant to the research questions, right? So for some class of questions, like you may intrinsically care about kind of the interactions between participants. And so for there, kind of taking this very seriously is really important. For others, again, you can do some things to get around this. So again, you can minimize interference by sampling individuals unlikely to interact. So again, if you're using, for instance, social media ads for recruiting, you can get people from various different parts of the country. Some studies have used cluster randomized design, right? So this Larson et al. Again randomizes at the regional level, so it's less important if there's spillovers within a particular unit. And so again, this is something to be aware of. In terms of challenges to interpretation, again, when you're doing these studies, again, especially if you're kind of an external researcher doing things on a platform, there's a lot of unobservable actions by the platform that you kind of have to think about, right? And so in particular, one famous example of this is if you're trying to measure, for instance, the effects of advertising, you can't just kind of compare, a group of people that saw ads versus that don't, because as we've talked about, all ads are typically optimized for targeting. And so again, you kind of have this weird thing where kind of the treatment group is kind of selecting into the set of people that the ad's probably good for, right? And so again, that's still measuring a meaningful treatment effect, but you kind of have to think very carefully about exactly what it is you're measuring. The second thing is that, again, there's potential different sets of compliers, right? So remember, again, this example of kind of we're interested in the effect of X on Y, we can really only kind of move around Z. So one well-known example of this is, for instance, in the set of papers that try to measure the effects of exposing users to cross-cutting content. Again, there's some mixed findings in the literature, but there's kind of differences in the sets of compliers, right? So for instance, in Roy's paper, people aren't necessarily incentivized to follow these pages, whereas in the Bale et al. Paper, they are. Again, this may lead to some differences in the interpretation of kind of what we're actually measuring. A third thing is, again, this partial versus general equilibrium. Again, a lot of these types of studies are kind of moving around a subset of individuals while kind of keeping everyone else fixed. And so again, these are typically kind of best complemented with observational work that does kind of accounts for these general equilibrium effects. And then finally, these experiments typically tend to measure short-term effects. Okay. Two final limitations and challenges. Again, external validity is really important. And again, ethics is first ordered here. Again, you're going to be thinking about a lot of types of interventions, which are kind of going to be fundamentally measuring sort of potentially sensitive things that people are doing. And so this should always be kind of a first order concern in design. Okay. Let me conclude by talking about some open questions kind of across the life cycle of content and for which these experiments can potentially be valuable. And so again, this is going back to our JL article. So again, most existing evidence that we have is on platforms like Facebook and Twitter, whereas a lot of these sort of newer platforms are a little bit underrepresented in the literature. And so, kind of some open questions on this front are again, if we think about this shift towards new platforms, does this kind of reflect a transition from content personalized to users to content that's completely algorithmic curated? Like, what is the sort of implications of this? Is this reflecting kind of technological improvement in real-time recommendations, a maturing market with diversification? Is this change kind of entailing an increase of entertainment at the expense of news on social media? Furthermore, there's been a bit of a shift in business models, right? So if you think about the model that Lena wrote down, again, we've mainly thought of kind of advertising generated revenue as the main business model of the platform, but there's been a move towards subscriptions and decentralization more broadly. And so kind of how does that impact a lot of these sort of downstream measures that we talked about is particularly important to know. Again, there's many ongoing policy discussions. There's an increasing use of AI on these social media platforms. Again, you know, both from the content production side in terms of again using tools like ChatGPT to kind of generate posts, and on the sort of moderation side of kind of using some of these more sophisticated content moderation techniques. And so again, there's sort of an open questions of kind of how do users interact with these bots? How do these advances kind of impact distribution and production of content? Okay. And so again, we think kind of these experiments are a powerful tool for researchers to have in their toolkit. And you may have looked at this and kind of said, well, this seems relatively involved. These typically have kind of lower barriers to entry relative to kind of getting Meta to run a study for you or X to run a study for you. And so again, many of the mentioned papers here are kind of on tight budgets or by junior authors. And so again, we think that this is a particularly useful methodological tool that researchers can kind of use to study some of these sort of bigger questions about social media. Yeah, and so yeah, with that, that's all we have for the tutorial. Again, these are based on two papers, the JL paper and this handbook chapter. The slides and the papers are on the tutorial website if you want to kind of dig in and read a little more. But yeah, otherwise, we'll open it up, I guess, for any questions about my part or Lena's part.